what we have now on the carcass of the Ukraine is a British agreement. Starmer called it a 100-year pact. I can't believe that in the small print of Starmer's 100-year pact with Zelensky, there wasn't British access to the same mineral resources that Trump is talking about. But Trump isn't so impolite, neither is Starmer so impolite, as to reveal that they're competing with one another. But if you look at the text of the mineral agreement, the mineral investment agreement, which was released by the Ukrainians 2 or 3 days ago and then found its way into the Financial Times and in the Western press. That text you can read on Dances with Bez. I've run the link and analyzed the provisions. It concedes in small print, subtly, much too subtle for Donald Trump, that pre-existing agreements, meaning concessions which Zelensky's already signed with the British, would not be included in what's available to the Americans. It's a very interesting point you've raised. The Americans are in competition with the British, probably the French too, over what's left of the carcass worth their while. And Trump decorates that by a fix first about the accessibility of the rare earth minerals in the Ukraine. They're not accessible. The other minerals that are accessible are in Russian territory now, in the Donbass: coal, iron ore, oil and gas in the seabed off Crimea. So you've got a mess of porridge, a kasha that the Americans want to scoop up with the Ukraine. And the British have already beaten them to the punch, so to speak, with their 100-year agreement. Of course, nothing Zelensky signs would necessarily be honored by a successor government after the so-called martial law and unconstitutional period ends in Saudi Arabia, lobbying Abdulaziz, for example, during World War II, between 43, let's say, when Kim Philby's father, St. John Philby, was the principal British lobbyist for the oil companies and for oil concessions in Saudi Arabia, versus Marine Colonel Bill Eddy, who was the principal US lobbyist for oil concessions. The British, and that story was repeated in Iran, it was repeated elsewhere. I think they've already are part of the deal. It reminds me of the negotiations, if that's quite the right word, and the competition between, on the one hand, the British, and on the other hand, the Americans, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, after World War I, as they were seeking to establish their own oil concessions in Iran, as you know very well, and in the Arab sheikdoms along the Persian Gulf, and the Saudi oil, Saudi, Syrian, and other Arab oil deposits. The British and the Americans competed fiercely. There is an unstated competition, and Trump's doing what Americans have always done to the British in Iran and in the Arab world, and that's been covered up. The Russian position is negotiable with the American position if the Americans accept that there must be an election and Zelensky's gone. But Zelensky, Budanov, and all of the others that represent the Russia-hating, race-hating, fascist structure of Kievan rule, that's also got to go. How that can be negotiated, how to prevent the long-term establishment of a Lvov state that's a terrorist state, a military state that would be committed forever to fighting Russia and hating the Slavs. How to do that is a major problem. It's a multi-year problem. Politicians who can't live so long and can't expect voters to support them for so long will want to postpone. Now, on Thursday in Washington, as you remember, Trump was asked about calling Zelensky a dictator. And he said, did I say that? I don't believe I said that. So he took it back. And the reason he took it back is that Zelensky is on the way to sign the deal that was enough for Trump to achieve. These are games at the end of a regime. I've suggested in print that the warnings that Trump was delivering, some crude, some as subtle as Trump is capable of. Subtlety is not his strong suit. Words aren't his strong suit. On the other hand, it's impossible not to see, on the one hand, attacking Zelensky for not signing the minerals agreement that the new US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent took to Kiev a couple of weeks back. Exactly what was in the text that Zelensky rejected has not been revealed. During the argument, as you say, as your question refers, Trump insulted Zelensky and reminded him that which side of the bread the butter is and who provides it, and called him a dictator. Clearly, people below the level of Trump and his ministers, so the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the head of intelligence, below that level, there are mid-level officials who have been put in place. We can talk about their names in a minute. They're all committed Russia war fighters. Those people want to achieve some sort of a transition that involves an election and a replacement of Zelensky and a restabilization of the political forces in Kiev that would be stable enough to maintain whatever it is the US wants, that Russia will allow them to have left after the Russian army does the job, completes its movement west, and completes the demilitarization objective of the special military operation. Are reminiscent of the way the Vietnam War ended, in which the US murdered Ngo Dinh Diem, the president of South Vietnam, and then subsequently had problems with each of the successive military officers in Vietnam as their war was being lost. But what Trump has done towards Zelensky is a display of American imperialism of a perfectly normal kind. It was a polite invitation to get packing and move, and he backed off because from underneath come the officials in the State Department, Louis Bono, from the Pentagon, Elbridge Colby, from the CIA, Ratcliffe CIA, and from the Budget Bureau, where the money is paid for these special operations. From this level of official comes the modification so that the US position is preserved in whatever successor to Zelensky, whatever successor regime that will be, and it's likely not to be Petro Poroshenko, but much more likely to be General Zaluzhny. This is the South Vietnam pattern. It's the Americans playing politics as they lose their war. And it's the Russian job to fight the war to the Russian end and let the Americans pick up the pieces that are left for the Americans to pick up in Lvov and Kiev. Those pieces won't include Zelensky. They might include Zaluzhny, but the political structure of the rump of the Ukraine follows after Russia's achieved its military objectives. The Russian drive has to be with a demilitarized zone between the westernmost line of Russia, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk and Lugansk, and Odessa, and the Polish, somewhere, the demilitarized zone's got to be west of Kiev. As far as the Polish border, let's see. These are negotiables. But here's a problem. It's a problem for Russians to debate now, and it's a problem for Russian politicians in Kremlin versus the general staff. What is the time frame that you're building a military deconfliction zone with the Americans and the others? What's the time frame in which it can last before war starts again? What does the presence of peacekeeping forces mean? In fact, practically speaking, such a peacekeeping force, and I wish people would understand this, has to be on the western side, the western line of the demilitarized zone. They're the ones who threaten to destabilize a peace agreement after the Ukraine has been defeated, as the Russian side is defeating it. So the demilitarized zone could have peacekeeping forces, but they would be essentially an anti-terrorist force protecting what's left of the Ukraine and the western border of Russia, the Novorossiya border, from terrorism coming from Lvov. That's how it would be structured. Can it be done? Yes, it can be done technically. Is it expensive? Yes. Second, the practical reach of long-term security for the general staff must be a demilitarized zone deep enough to prevent long-range drones, missiles, rockets, artillery from ever threatening Russia again, either the new Novorossiya or the hinterland of Russia. Now, that's a tall order. It's not, I'm not telling anybody any news. Mr. Lavrov has described the depth. President Putin has referred to the sanitary zone. That's what it must mean in military terms. And Russia has to be able to enforce it by intelligence means on the ground, by satellites, drones, and other forms of patrol. The framework that Russia has tabled as the Non-Aggression Reciprocal Security Treaty with the United States of December 17, 2021, and the parallel treaty with NATO at the same time, would involve a redesign of security architecture in which the principal nuclear and long-range missile threats to Russia would be removed. The US would withdraw. And I've just mentioned that Regicov in northern Poland and Devasilu in northern Romania, let's call them the touchstones of this new security architecture under the December 2021 treaties that, in my judgment, Macron implied would be negotiable, not Starmer. Now, militarily, General Staff doesn't like such a short-term advantage. Politicians consider short-term as long-term because it lasts as long as they're in power. So that the Russian succession to President Putin has to be concerned about this timeline. Nobody wants to succeed the president in the Kremlin and face a resumption of war. How to construct a long enough period of no war for Russia to recover, for the Novorossiya to be redeveloped and so forth and so on. That's an argument in Russia right now. It's a sensible debate. People of goodwill can differ with one another. We are yet to see a consensus that goes onto the negotiating table with the Americans. So many Russian sources tell me that they would be satisfied with a structure that would last 5 to 10 years, better 10 years than 5, in the expectation that the war will restart again. Politicians include, and they're normal in Moscow, inside the Kremlin, as they are everywhere else, have a relatively limited time horizon. And President Putin's succession and successors are already thinking of what's the time, how does the war end in a way that advantages or changes the succession between now and 2030, for example. The reason that it was necessary for Russia at high level, President Putin spoke to President Xi Jinping. As you said, Foreign Minister Lavrov went to Johannesburg for a G20 meeting and met a great many allies, including the Foreign Minister Jai Shankar of India and President President Putin may be in India to meet Prime Minister Modi in a few weeks' time. It's good politics and good strategy to have done what you've just described happened. It's another matter again what the Chinese interpret, what the Iranian side interprets, what the Indian side interprets of what they've heard from the Russian side, and what questions, if any, remain, and what doubts might remain. Those doubts, if there are any, skepticism, Chinese skepticism, Indian skepticism, Iranian skepticism, Korean skepticism, is under wraps. It's behind closed doors. If we knew it, I mightn't say it. The purpose of all of these meetings is to, first of all, explain Russia will stick to its commitments and will not abandon any of its commitments as their allies might interpret what Russia did in Syria. So it's not just an explanation, a briefing on what is happening in the Russian-US talks. It's not simply, this is what's happened at Riyadh. This is how we see the follow-up from Riyadh. This is what Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's money man, is proposing to do with Trump's money man, Stephen Witkoff. This is what the different constituencies in Moscow, the oligarchs, would like out of a war settlement. It's not simply a briefing like that. That's an important element, but it's a briefing about what happened in Syria and why allies, Iran, North Korea, China, and India should not believe that Russia betrays its commitments. That too is part of the discussion, because there are elements inside Moscow, particularly business elements, particularly those pushing Kirill Dmitriev, President Putin's special emissary for economic negotiations with the United States. There are elements who would betray for their commercial interest. Trump is behaving in a stable and consistent way. He does not understand the detail of any of the major issues currently involved in, first, the end of war negotiations, and second, the so-called minerals agreement with the Ukraine. He does not understand the detail, and Macron was much better able to exploit his disabilities and pacify Trump's relatively short fuse. He has both short concentration span, his cognition is damaged, he repeats himself over and over with the same slogans. And if listeners want, they can go to the Dances with Bears reports where I quote exactly what was said. Yes, there are very significant differences between the way in which President Trump received and spoke with President Macron of France, and the way in which the meetings with Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of England or Britain, took place on Thursday. Then what's very interesting, and I'll go first to Starmer and then back to Macron. Starmer showed a level of hatred for the Russians, a level of emphatic wanting to stay in war with President Putin. They can't even use the term President Putin, let alone Mr. Putin. It's always Putin. Starmer is a Russia hater. He's a race hater whose doctrine of fighting Russia goes back to the British fighting of the Crimean War. It's obvious in Starmer's case. He can't control it. When you quote exactly what Trump says with the ums, the ahs, the hesitations, the repeats, which is not what the transcript services, for example, rollcall.com, runs a transcript of what happens. The White House has stopped providing transcripts. When you compare the transcript and the newspaper reports with the actual remarks, Trump cognitively damaged. The man is handicapped, both in understanding what he's being asked, understanding what he's hearing from his counterparts and understanding what in fact is under negotiation. That's why, and it's very interesting to see, he has the vice president, J.D. Vance, sitting with him in the meetings. Vance is intellectually the most capable man in the room. And in the Starmer meeting, Trump actually asked Vance to speak. This is of interest. It's much more significant than I've seen vice presidents handled in the past. What was obvious also was that he showed up late at the White House. What was then planned to be a press conference at 2 p.m. was delayed by 90 minutes. It seems clear to me that Starmer and Trump or their staffs had a real trouble making their positions more acceptable in their public presentations. And you can see Starmer's script on the lectern, curled pages that he was reading from or trying to read from had been corrected over and over or several times over. In other words, there were serious disagreements or failures to agree between Starmer. So Trump is behaving consistently, and increasingly we will see all of the European leaders who meet with him will understand his disabilities and also understand the uncertainties and the risks of insulting him or being perceived to insult him. And that's the first part of your question. The second part of your question is, how was it different? In the Dances with Bears, I've analyzed the Macron meeting and then the Starmer meeting. You can do it by measuring the amounts of time that was taken by Trump versus the others. Trump allowed Macron to say more than he allowed Starmer to say more. Second, Starmer was reduced to a handful of seconds, roughly 12% of the Oval Office press conference was Starmer's managing to get words in. So putting everybody in the same room doesn't work until it's clearer what the US itself aims to do, and that's not clear. Yes, President Putin says, and it's right to say, there's reason for a certain hope that the pragmatism of the US side is the basis for a negotiation, one on an end of war on the battlefield, about which Trump sloganizes all the time. Death, young people being killed, buildings being flattened. He keeps repeating the same images. Why? Because he can't read. Trump sees pictures. That's how he's briefed. And until we get to a level of detail in which we can understand what the US practically is ready to do, it's not possible to bring together the different political systems, France, Germany, Italy, the UK, Spain, the old NATO allies on the one hand, and the relatively new, the post-97 NATO members, Poland, the Baltic states, Bulgaria, Eastern Europe essentially. Their needs, their social internal needs are all common. The costs of fighting Russia are unbearable for them all, but the costs are different between Germany, Poland, Britain, and Italy, and so forth. Because of these internal political divisions that structure the politics of these countries at different parts of the election cycle for each of them, they're each responding to their own domestic constituencies and playing politics with their domestic factions, parties, and voters. This is normal, it's appropriate, it's democratic. To assemble a common European alliance view on spending more money, lifting the defense budgets in countries which are desperately short of social welfare spending, as Britain is extremely difficult for all of these states. And we've seen the impact of the war and the economic war against Russia, raising the costs of electricity, gas, heating, water, everything that makes life possible in Europe has been severely damaged by each country's commitments to war against Russia, economic war as well as military war. The very short meeting between Trump and President Duda of Poland was really a Polish intention, given that there's a presidential election coming up in Poland, in which the country is split in half. East minimizes the Russian threat and emphasizes the German threat to Poland. The East is more likely to vote for Duda's party. The West of Poland more likely to vote for the current Tusk government. In the same way that Germany is divided east from west. In East Germany, the election clearly was won by the AfD, the Alliance for Germany, and a combination, and both the CDU and, of course, the SPD, the Social Democrats, the Scholz coalition, and the Greens were all very badly defeated in East Germany. And it's the opposite in West Germany. The odd thing about this is that Starmer is raising and demanding and insisting on and emphasizing conditions which are completely unacceptable to the Russian side. And this has been repeated over and over. Trump and Starmer appear to have discussed the idea that first there should be a ceasefire, and then that would be followed by some form of military withdrawal and political settlement. This is not acceptable to the Russian side, and it's been repeated over and over from Putin, President Putin, from Foreign Minister Lavrov, from spokesman Peskov, and so forth. Repeatedly, Russia will not accept a ceasefire or a freeze of conflict along the line of conflict. Why should it? It's already advancing. The other side is crumbling. The Russian army is winning slowly with some limitations tactically, operationally, and so forth. But why would the Russians accept a ceasefire to enable the other side to rearm? We've been through that. We went through that with the Minsk protocols, now admitted by President Hollande of France and Chancellor Merkel of Germany, to have been a pause to refresh their military capabilities and prepare to fight again. What Starmer is doing is proposing a peace agreement that is known to be unacceptable from beginning to end to the Russian side. Even Trump knows that, although he keeps repeating, as you heard him say, that we'll try to get Ukrainian land back. But even Trump, who repeated that several times over, acknowledges his own skepticism that it will be possible. Why does Starmer push a ceasefire? And then you've got the concept of a peacekeeping force composed of the British, the French, the Europeans. Trump repeats it in a slogan form. Starmer repeated it also. There's much more subtlety with the French position. But why is Starmer repeating things everyone knows are unacceptable to the Russians? That leaves us with one interpretation only. It's the perfidious Albion interpretation. The British can't fight on the ground. Their method is deception, propaganda, the English language as a weapon. In my judgment, Starmer isn't serious about reaching an end to war. Trump is more serious, but completely foggy and incapable of understanding the details. Basically, Starmer wants to continue fighting and is offering the appearance of peace talks that constitute essentially a deception and can't make any progress unless the US commits to them. And Starmer is failing and failed to get Trump and Vance and the US delegation to sign on to the British conditions, as was repeatedly asked of Starmer and Trump. Will the US provide a military backing for any peacekeeping force that might involve the British? And the answer is evasive and sloganeering on the part of Trump. He basically goes back to saying, we will be in the Ukraine because we will be digging holes, digging to our heart's content. I think it was Trump's notion, a very peculiar way of describing mining in a conflict zone. It's absurd, but we can get back to the text of the minerals agreement later. On the one hand, Starmer wants to continue war fighting against Russia. On the other hand, everybody understands, and certainly Trump understands, that the UK has no weapons that it can use on the Ukrainian battlefield, either Storm Shadow missiles or Challenger tanks or aircraft, which the Russian side hasn't destroyed and defeated over the last 3 years. Second, the British Army is small and incapable of mounting anything, any operation beyond a small special operations gang of cutthroats. It can do special operations, but it can't run an army. And Trump begins at the second press conference, 90 minutes late, by saying Obama was a tough negotiator and he doesn't really like it. On the other hand, Trump did his best to minimize insults and emphasize what the British had come for, the celebration of the so-called special relationship between Britain and the United States. And that turned into a slogan for Trump, whom the British complimented and appeased by inviting him through King Charles III to make another state visit to England. So what is being discussed as if it's reasonable is that Starmer wants to put British boots on the ground, but only on condition that they are fully protected from the air and on the ground by the United States, which means essentially a US military guarantee for any peacekeeping, so-called peacekeeping force. Macron never made such a position.